Hi, everybody. How are you? I hope everyone is having a lovely Tuesday. Oh, it's Tuesday. In the lovely month of April, allergy month for so many sufferers, allergy sufferers out there. But while we're here, it's time for stories from my grandfather's book, Nowhere Except San Francisco, Memoirs of a Resident Tourist. I hope that you are ready for some great stories today. I don't know if my computer is going to crash at some point. I will try and keep an eye. It might pause for a second as it does once an hour these days, and I will do what I can to run over and fix it really fast. So bear with me if the technical difficulties get in the middle of everything. My cat is here. She wants to be in the middle of everything. Don't you, Stella? Don't you? Purr, purr, purr. Yeah, she's full of the purrs right now. What? Come here. Come here. You gonna help me read? Come on, Stella. Come on. Come on. Now I just look like a crazy person. There we go. Talking to somebody on the floor. Yeah, this is Stella, if you haven't met Stella before. She's going to help me read today. She wants me to let her out the window to attack the birds and the squirrels in the backyard, but we're not going to let that happen. Are you ready for a story? This is a brief interlude called Send Them a Message. In song and story, Telegraph Hill has always been a place for fun and frolic. During the 1850s, the steep slopes featured bars that equaled the best London and Sydney had to offer. Such deadfalls as the Magpie, the Bobby Burns, the Bird in Hand, and the Tam O'Shanter were well known, but not for their decor or service. Many of their customers entered at extreme peril. Once in, they never came out, at least not vertically. The Vigilance Committee set out to look into the wild and widespread rumors and found, to absolutely no one's amazement, that the bartenders were handy with a sandbag. Most of the owners and employees were Australian convicts with long records of murder and mayhem in their native city, hence the nickname Sydney Coves. While these opportunists obviously came to seek their fortunes, they didn't live to tell about how they made it. The Vigilance Committee spent little time adding their names to those already on the tombstones in the graveyard at Mission Dolores. Cough, cough, excuse me. A little bit of stuff in my throat, but things are good here. Cat hair. All right. The Dalton Boys. That is the chapter that we are on to now. Who were the Dalton Boys? I don't know. Let's find out. Hello, Shaolin. Thank you. Yes, greetings to my cat. She has now run off after somebody else, probably hoping to get snacks, treats, etc. The Dalton Boys. That's where we're going now. The last thing in the world you would have guessed the Daltons, father and son, to be, if you looked at them, even carefully, was booksellers. Usually, booksellers, on the surface at least, are rather mild, inoffensive, diffident, and retiring. If found in a crowd, a bookseller could not easily be separated from the hotel desk clerks, members of the local garden club, or even private detectives. The ordinaries, who are usually voted most likely to be missed in a lineup. The Daltons, on the other hand, both father and son, stood out in a crowd. Not that they wore green velvet vests or smoked meerschaum pipes, but they were definitely a different breed of booksellers. No matter how their detractors maligned them with actionable epithets and curses, the Daltons just smiled and went right on gulling the gullible with their particular chatter. For the most part, the conventional booksellers of San Francisco who sought to derail them were victims of jealousy, or whatever bitter emotion someone feels when he is bested in his chosen field. As a rule, wealth and its accumulation stirs lesser beings to fury. The Dalton name at any gathering of the San Francisco booksellers generated vituperative invective. For booksellers in San Francisco, the Daltons were an odd but irritating burr, and the booksellers weren't used to this kind of vexation. If those same booksellers were alive today, I hate to think what they would have to say of such emporia as Barnes & Noble, Borders, and Amazon.com. The chief source of their discomfort was that while the old-line booksellers were bad-mouthing their challengers, Dalton, father and son, were piling up a small fortune. Between 1939 and 1946, during most of World War II, they took great pleasure in selling more books and making more money than any other bookseller in San Francisco. Unlike most of their competitors, if you could distinguish them in that way, the Daltons squirreled the money away in American rolling mill shares. In case anyone missed the object of their affection, American Rolling Mill was a major supplier of steel for the manufacture of tanks and other implements of war. Who's here? Hello, John R. Sports. In the minds of their detractors, father and son were unconscionable, unscrupulous extortioners. The Daltons loved it. Envy on the part of competitors is mother's milk to the ego that finds pleasure in accomplishment. The local booksellers cataloged themselves as upstanding, conservative, diligent, and worthy of civic admiration. And believe me when I say this was the general opinion of all the locals. However, the opinion of the average man in the street was that bookselling was what you did if you weren't very good at painting or writing. The Daltons always thought piling them high and selling them cheap was the object of any business and never equated their employment with intellectual activity. Their satisfaction came from inventive, nimble ways to make money, plus a vast capacity for enjoyment, mostly at other people's expense. When they finally realized the potential of book selling, they thought they had died and gone to heaven. In the early days of the war with Japan, thousands of sailors, soldiers, Marines, and merchant mariners, people who had a lot of time for reading and money in their pockets, were wandering up and down Market Street in an ever-changing parade. What more could a con man ask for? The fairs and carnivals at which father and son had learned the ins and outs of gulling marks were long gone. Instead of putting up with card tables and wind-driven dust at America's carnival midways, they could stand in a warm store and hustle the Johns in comfort. No longer did they have to pitch dictionaries and encyclopedias of dubious origin to the dolts and dullards shuffling aimlessly through state and county fairs. Sidney Dalton was a man of medium to tall height. Had he been willing to stand up straight, he would have approached 6 feet, but he never stood up, since he was always slinking about the shop, hunched over, peering out at friend and foe alike from under lowered eyelids. He always looked as though he expected trouble to jump out of the floor. If not right now, certainly later. He missed very little of what was going on. Hello, cat. Sorry, you missed the off-screen activity over here. My cat just jumped up the wall to hang from the windowsill from her front paws. That was interesting. You're crazy. Yeah, you are, meow meow. Okay. All right, Sidney Dalton missed very little of what was going on. He didn't have many friends, since there wasn't much room for friends after he got through counting the foes. When I knew him, he was well past middle age, probably approaching 60, but his skin was starting to bag in places and bulge in others, and had that shiny sheen that seems to accompany age. Since he spent so much time indoors, he had developed what could best be described as gambler's pallor. Some people describe it as neon tan, but no matter. He moved slowly, deliberately, and when he approached you in the shop, you felt you should duck. The son, Ed, was probably in his late 30s, but he too had developed his father's wary approach to life. He was well set up, portly almost, perhaps barrel-chested, as polite tailors describe people with bulging waistlines. He could have lost 20 or 30 pounds and never missed them. His face was round and red with a nose that looked as though it had been borrowed from Santa Claus. His eyes reminded me of the bubbles in a carpenter's level. Bald on top of his head, he sported a graying fringe of hair at his temples, while his father prowled the aisles of the shop, flicking ash from his ever-present cigar and sizing up a possible sale. Ed sat behind the metal cash drawer, glumly contemplating the crowd that usually filled the store. He let his eyes do his walking for him, and it was a rare day when a shoplifter so much as neared the front door before Ed began ringing one of those bells you see on the reception counters of shops where there is only one attendant. The father, thus alerted, began to form a perimeter defense. To my knowledge, Ed never laughed, rarely smiled, believing quite firmly that life was not only real and earnest, but also filled with felons intent on destroying his means of livelihood. Carnivals and fairs had sharpened his anxiety. Beguiling the unwary was a learned skill. As trained barkers, Sidney Dalton and his son had developed their ability to sell into a fine art. It would not be extravagant to say they regarded all customers as marks. More accurately, prey. Sidney particularly was proud of his ability to so electrify his targets he could sell them almost anything. Their life in San Francisco began when the World's Fair of the West on Treasure Island closed its gates in 1939. The fair had not been all that profitable, and they still had a considerable supply of dictionaries and encyclopedias on hand, so they moved their pitch to a vacant store on Market Street, the better to snag the unwary shoppers before moving on to other pastures. They decorated their window space with dictionaries and encyclopedias, since that was temporarily their only stock in trade. All was routine dullness for a long time, but then the Japanese Empire had the temerity to bomb the American fleet tied up in neat rows at Pearl Harbor, and it wasn't long before San Francisco in general and Market Street in particular filled with servicemen, thousands of them, being ever alert to the call of opportunity. The Daltons henceforth became de facto booksellers, not by accident, but by popular demand. As sailors, soldiers, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, Seabees, and assorted war-related gentry passed the Dalton shop, they saw books in the window, and without looking to see what kind of books, came into the shop and began asking, "You got Forever Amber? How about something by Frank Yerby? I want a copy of Gone with the Wind. You sell Bibles." The questions were endless and embarrassing. Most likely, for the first time in their lives, father and son felt a sharp sense of inadequacy as they looked at their shelves, filled with encyclopedias and dictionaries. However, it didn't take them long to rise above their handicap. They weren't about to have it said they were a couple of fakirs displaying dictionaries and implying romance and erotica. They went searching for a stock of popular literature. With the public begging for contemporary literature almost hourly, they applied to various publishing houses. All they found was blank walls and locked doors. Publishers crossed streets to avoid them and refused their phone calls. "When I tried to get books from the publishers," said Dalton Sr. one day, "they wouldn't open any new accounts because we were new. And then there was a war on and paper was short, things like that. Any excuse." Such downturns merely whetted the Dalton Sr.'s appetite. He wanted to become a bookseller, and if they had to be legitimate about it, okay. So one day, Sidney heard that the San Francisco News Company was the local distributor for practically every publisher in the United States. He paid them a visit, inquiring how he could buy some books to satisfy the incessant demand he was entering. Let me see if I can read here. Bloop, bloop, bloop. Shoop, 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 shoop. He paid them a visit, inquiring how he could buy some books to satisfy the incessant demand he was entertaining on Market Street. The local manager carefully explained he could supply the books, but only on a cash basis. Sidney mulled over the proposition and said, "Cash? Cash only." Dalton Sr. stuffed his hand in his pocket and produced a roll of paper, which, when unfolded, turned out to be $100 bills. The manager gaped. Such eye-popping proof of solvency was not customary. $100 bills were assets seldom seen at the news company, especially presented by booksellers. Most news company customers stayed awake nights figuring out how to stretch terms of 2%, 10 days to 60, 90, or 120 days. Cash in those days following the Great Depression was a rare sight. Dalton spent the rest of that day placing his order. A big one. The next morning, the cartons and cases of books from the news company tumbled onto the sidewalk in front of the Dalton store. The Daltons looked matters over and were in carnival heaven. Thousands of marks on the sidewalk, tons of saleable merchandise on hand trucks, and a supplier just around the corner. Visions of all that could be enjoyed with infinite riches began dancing in their heads. Long before the Daltons got interested in matters literary, fixed pricing had become a way of life. Fair trade laws said you couldn't cut prices, but no one ever thought to mention someone might raise prices. The only discount store or mail-order discount firm anyone ever saw was when a bookseller went bankrupt and had to sell out, or one of his children begged a book for a birthday party. In that case, the discount was 100%. No one needed to fear the Daltons were going into the discount business. However, the very thought of that would have paralyzed them. Discounts were not what the Daltons had in mind. Their goal was to find ways to kite the prices without slowing sales. Books you could buy anywhere in the United States for $1.75 became $2.75 in the Dalton shop. The Daltons figured, and rightly so, that the vast majority of their potential customers had bought very few books in the past and had no idea what the regular price was. Fair trade meant prices printed on the jacket flap were the selling price all across the nation, no ifs, ands, or buts. The Daltons realized right from day one that their customers had bought books only now and then, mostly then, and by the time the customers on Market Street discovered books sold for less in any store in town, they would be worrying more about dodging Japanese soldiers and aviators than how the Daltons had flim-flammed them in San Francisco. A favorite joke of the time was the Marine who slit open a letter from the Book of the Month Club during a bombing attack on Guadalcanal that read, "Since you have not responded to our last 3 letters, we intend to take legal action. Be my guest." Another feature of the Dalton store was that unless you were careful, you got sold a stack of books you neither wanted nor needed. In some way only a master salesman understands, Dalton Sr. could generate excitement in a customer's mind that would actually hypnotize him into trading money for books. At least I guess that's what it was. One day a young man of indeterminate nationality stepped up to Sydney and asked, "You got any of the works of Oscar Micheaux?" Oscar Micheaux was a popular novelist of the period who wrote stories about life in New York's Harlem. Sydney regarded the young man, and I could almost hear the wheels in his mental calculator begin to hum. "Why, son, you bet we have, and I might add you have made an excellent choice." There were 4 Micheaux titles on a nearby table, and Sydney picked all of them up and put them in the man's hands. He didn't stop there, however. On top of the pile, he added a couple of sex manuals, a Bible, a lurid story about lesbians, until arms could hold no more. Sydney didn't stop talking. He just led the fellow to the cash drawer and began to add the sale. At length he named a price, took the money, wrapped the books in a grocery sack, gave the change, and the young man walked out of the shop, muttering, "I don't know why I bought all these books. I ain't never gonna read 'em." So amazed I didn't know what to say. I walked back on Market Street to compare some of the prices in a store up the street. I realized both the customer and I had been under mild hypnosis. They were sure they were being given a special privilege when they were sold a book for double the price. They could have bought it anywhere else. Once I asked Sidney Dalton if the customers ever balked at the prices. He said, "Nah, when they complain, we tell them the books in this store are unabridged editions, And the reason we charge a lot is because they're getting the full text, whereas those books you buy somewhere else are abridged. I often wondered if Sidney knew what abridged meant. One thing I'll say for Sidney, he was never speechless. When he needed freshets of words to wrap up a sale, they practically spilled out of his mouth. I asked him one day how he got people so excited, and he said, "Hell, you can't talk to you. To sell 'em, you gotta tell 'em." Ed Dalton, the son, was equally adept at turning objections into sales. To my knowledge, he never smiled, believing life was a fleeting opportunity at best, and the only way to turn dollars into dreams was to rev up sales talk. Once I asked him how the Dalton shop did such a tremendous business, and he said, "My God, man, as long as you can talk and there's someone to talk to, you can make a sale." One day as I walked into the shop, Sidney was putting the vacuum cleaner back behind some boxes in the back of the store. Evidently, it had taken more energy than he usually exerted since beads of sweat glazed his forehead. As he wiped the moisture aside, he said, "Thank God, that's over." "What's over?" I asked. "Well, the combination of housework and that dame who was just in here was a bit more than I can take so early in the morning." "What happened?" "This old dame came in and claimed I cheated her when I sold her a Bible for $15. She had gone up the street and found the same Bible in another store for $4.95. Wait till she finds out the one I traded her for ordinary sells for $3.75, but then she was so happy I doubt she'll be shopping around much anymore. She said she was buying it for her son in the service, and I told her if I had known that, I never would have sold it to her in the first place. I told her what she needed was the one with the steel binding that fits in the shirt pocket and protects anyone who puts it in there from bullets that might kill him." "You mean a bulletproof Bible?" "That's what people think. Hell, that tin wouldn't stop a BB fired from a Daisy pump gun." "So when is she going to find out?" "Don't think she ever will. The odds of a bullet hitting anyone in the heart are about 5,000 to 1, and if he gets shot anywhere else, it isn't the Bible's fault." "Let's hope the tin doesn't rust." Sidney looked at me for a second or two and then turned to pull the curtains over his vacuum cleaner. Most likely through his association with his father, Ed had learned a thing or two about pitching merchandise. The sales talk that used to make me laugh was when some little old lady would wander up to the counter with a book in her hand and say, "Hi, man, what can you tell me about this book?" Ed would solemnly declare that the book had recently won the Catholic Book Award. And not only that, but also the Minnesota Critics Annual Medal. He had a couple of other noble-sounding awards, but I can't remember them now. He also explained that the book had a lifetime bug-proof washable binding. It never seemed to matter to the prospect that at her present age, lifetime could mean a variety of things, that she rarely washed the covers of a book, and that she certainly didn't need to worry about bugs in San Francisco. Finding Ed's reassurance reassuring, she would nod her head sagely with each new benefit Ed pitched and cluck, cluck about the wonder of it all. Ed was standing at the counter one afternoon when a young man came up with a book titled Diana, A Strange Autobiography, in one hand and a scrap of paper in the other. Diana was a current novel about lesbianism, and in those days, proper people didn't discuss such matters. "What does this mean?" the young man asked. "I pulled this book off the shelf, and this piece of paper fell out on the floor." Apparently, approximately 50 minutes after the hour is when my when my computer crashes. Okay, where were we? What was the last thing you heard? Diana, a strange autobiography. Maybe I'll start at that. I don't know where I froze last time I looked up. Ed was standing at the counter one afternoon when a young man came up with a book titled Diana, a strange autobiography, in one hand and a scrap of paper in the other. Diana was a current novel about lesbianism, and in those days, proper people didn't discuss such matters. "What does this mean?" the young man asked. "I pulled this book off the shelf and this piece of paper fell out on the floor." As Ed took the scrap of paper from his hand and said, "Means what it says. For unexpurgated copy, see the clerk. This one costs $2. And as he recited this, he reached under the counter to produce an exact copy of the book the man had presented for exchange. He said, "This one is $3.50. We have to bring it in by express." The last sentence featured a sly glance around the store with an added conspiratorial tone to enhance the effect. The customer said, "Yeah? Really?" Obviously, he knew that salacious literature in those days could travel only by American Express because he dug into his pocket and brought out a $5 bill. Ed took the money, made the change, and put the under-the-counter version in a plain brown paper bag, thereby confirming any evil thoughts the man might be entertaining. In those days, naughty books really came in a plain paper wrapper, just as the ads in Whiz-Bang and Police Gazette advised. As the transaction unfolded, I began to sense that a confidence game was in progress, and the ancient adage that an honest man can't be cheated was being confirmed. When the customer had disappeared through the front door and turned into the Market Street crowd, I asked Ed if I could look at the dirty version under the counter. Just for fun, I thought I would note a page number and word placement and go down the street to another store and check it out. If the numbers and word placement were the same as those in the ordinary edition, then so was the rest of the book. Lead type is neither stretchable nor shrinkable. About a city block up the street, another store featured Diana right there, out there in plain sight. A stack of them, in fact. The page number and the word placement were identical with the one that came by express. Whenever the store filled up with people standing around reading, Ed got some action at the cash drawer by shaking up the customers. He hated the effect silent browsers had on business. Instead of cash drawers slamming, bells tinkling, and the dulcet sound of paper money unrolling, silence encourages a reader to concentrate on reading. Such an atmosphere was funereal as far as Ed was concerned. His theory was that when the cash register is ringing happily, more sales are made. So when the pall cast by the silent readers got more than he could stand, he would bang on the counter with his bell and shout at the top of his voice, "Closing up, folks, closing up for lunch," or dinner, or breakfast, or jury duty, or whatever, depending on the time of the day. The customers would jump. Some would hurry to the cash drawer with some book they thought they must have before the proprietor cut them off. Others would drift through the door into the street. When the shop was clear, Sydney would bang the door shut, leave it closed for maybe 60 seconds, then open it, ready for the next group of browsers to wander in. One day, for lack of anything better to do, he gave me a lesson in how to sell unabridged Webster dictionaries. In those days, a $50 sale. The Webster Dictionary includes, naturally, the word make. For such a short word, it has one of the longest definitions in the book. It runs on for almost 4 columns of closely typed space. When some unwary citizen asked how much the book sold for, Dalton Sr. never answered, just moved in with descriptions of completeness, dictionary expertise, authorities, and such, citing the word make as a perfect example of the thoroughness of the editors. Another favorite was help. Why, young man, imagine how much time and effort went into describing this simple word. Here you have a 4-letter word with more than 1,000 words to tell you what it means. Now that's class. Sidney, while he knew nothing of psychology that moves people to buy, knew instinctively that selling was mostly belaboring the obvious. He had the old adage down pat. To sell 'em, you gotta tell 'em. One day during a visit to this emporium of surprises, Sidney related how he had upset the generally orderly routine of the San Francisco News Company by making a cash purchase that almost caused the manager to lose his voice and his hairpiece. The shipping boys were unpacking a big stack of cartons, all containing the same book, A Modern Library Giant. I asked the guy why he would order so many copies of one book, and he told me Studs Lonigan was very popular with servicemen. How many have you got in those boxes? 2,000. I'll take 'em, cash deal. Dalton came as close to laughing as he ever did. The guy looked at me and asked me how I expected to sell 2,000 copies in one store. And I said I wouldn't be buying them if I didn't think I could sell them. And by the way, please deliver 'em as soon as possible. We had those books in the corners, under tables, packed behind other books on shelves, in the back, everywhere. But you know what? We sold them all in about 3 months, and I might add at $2.75 each. So we got the regular discount off the regular price of $1.75 plus $1 extra. That's the way you make money, son. Eventually, the New York publishers got very excited about his sales potential, and a few decided to open direct accounts. Random House was the first, and it turned into a profitable deal for both publisher and bookseller. One of the envious booksellers at the time complained to Random House. Dalton was unfair, selling books for more than the prices printed on the dust jacket flaps. Random wrote Dalton a letter saying that they understood he was not observing fair trade laws that said you couldn't cut established prices, but nothing about kiting them. Random warned Dalton that if he did not write a letter stating he would no longer raise prices, they would cancel his account. This shook Sidney. He liked the 40% discount he got from the publishers. In his mind, a great improvement over the 30% terms he got at the SF News Company. It was a hell of a note. We not only were getting $2.75 for studs, but we also sold a load of that there Ideal Marriage priced at $7.50 when we're getting $10. I used to sell about 100 a month. Sailors loved it, so I had to give in and write the letter. But in the meantime, I heard World Publishing Company had an edition of studs. You know that their book is a trilogy? That means the book is in 3 parts. And the way World Publishing put it out, in 3 volumes priced at 49 cents each instead of $1.75 for the Modern Library Giant, I ordered 1,000 copies of each of the 49-cent volume and sold them for $2.75 apiece. I was making a hell of a lot more money than I was in the first place. Shortly after the end of World War II, with Random House and Dalton again on an approximately level playing field, the West Coast representative for Random dropped into the Dalton shop. Right from the first meeting, the study in contrasts between the salesman from New York and Dalton was jolting. One, conservative, careful, measured in speech and manner, dressed in a Homburg hat and velvet-collared Chesterfield topcoat. The other, flamboyant, loud, coarse, abrasive, and dressed in whatever had come to hand when he opened his closet door that morning. The salesman walked to the counter and said, "Is the buyer in? My name is Jim Russell of Random House, and I'd like to ask him a few questions." Dalton looked him over and said, "What kind of questions?" Russell stammered. "Well, my boss, Lou Miller, wanted me to ask Mr. Dalton how he has been able to sell so many copies of Ideal Marriage. Mr. Miller says you folks have sold more copies than anyone else in the country. Dalton looked Russell over carefully, took his cigar out of his mouth, flicked the ash on the floor, and said, "Well, I'll tell you, son. We have a pitch." "A pitch? A pitch?" "Yeah, you know, a sales talk, I guess you'd call it. I get me a sailor here in the store, and I'll pull him over to one side and tell him about the 14 different positions described in the book. And if he complains about the price, I tell him not to worry. Once he gets back on the ship, he can rent the book to his buddies for 50 cents a crack, and he'd have his money back in no time. Them sailors are suckers for them 14 different positions, as who wouldn't be?" When the armed services traffic on Market Street began to fade away with the end of the war in the Pacific, Dalton decided one day he was going to close up. Not for a few moments, but for good. He and Ed planned to retire, forever if necessary, as well they could, since they had never sold so much as one share of their American rolling mill. Dalton plastered the windows outside and the walls inside with huge bold-lettered signs that said, "Closing out to the bare walls. Sale. Going out of business. Lost our lease. Save up to 87% and more." Dalton explained it didn't much matter what the signs said, so long as they said it loud and clear and blurted the news that customers could save money here, now. The first customers to respond to this bait were unable to find prices in any of the books, since Sydney had carefully clipped them. So when they asked the price, Sydney would hustle over, hold the book in the air, and shout, "How much is this one, Ed?" And Ed would think a second and then shout back, $6. Dalton would turn to the customer and say, "The book sells for $6, but you can have it for $3. Sometimes the customers were grateful for the bargain, never realizing the book sold anywhere else in town for $2.50. Some weeks after, I asked him if the sale had been successful. He exploded. "Success! I wish I could run one like that every month. We took in so much money we had to keep a cardboard carton behind the counter to throw the bills in. And we didn't go to the bank until the carton was overflowing and there was nowhere else to stuff the money. We could have bailed it." The final day, Dalton sat in his shop until there was only a small carton of books left from a stock of thousands. But the game was over. An American rolling mill was about to assume the job of keeping him and his son in pork chops and lima beans in a manner neither Dalton had ever experienced in the past. Laugh time was at hand. From closing day on, he didn't do much except prowl up and down Powell Street, from his apartment at the top of Nob Hill to Market Street. He always had his broad-brimmed fuzzy fedora tilted at a rakish angle. He buttoned only one white pearl button on his elegant camel's hair topcoat. His flowing ties sported such vivid hues they were blinding. They reminded me of nothing so much as the title of a book by Evelyn Waugh, "Put Out More Flags." His shirts, too, were flamboyant, with long, pointed collars and dyed in almost any color you could name and a few you couldn't. He carried an old-fashioned Malacca cane. By this time, my bookshop on Powell Street had become a drag. Since my business was nearly always bad in those days, Dalton's appearance was a break in the boredom of watching the customers pass by without stopping or standing around among the books without buying. Into this suffocating silence, Dalton would sweep like a tumbleweed driven by a tempest. "How's everybody today?" Then he would walk down among the browsers and whack a book with his cane. It didn't matter which book, and say, "Now there's a book just finished last week. You can't believe all the things that happened to the guy and the girls. Well, leave it to your imagination." Then he would pick up the book, thrust it into the hand of the nearest prospect, and walk out. Almost always, the customer responded to the hypnotic quality in Dalton's personality and bought the book. Since most of my trade was tourists, We didn't get all that many returns. Ed Dalton tried retirement for a while, but got bored and opened a small shop in Burlingame. Somehow, the zest had gone out of the business for Ed, and he had never had much will to build the business into more than what it was when he started. Quite some time apart, both men died. The book business was never the same for me again. I missed the zany sales talks, the befuddled customers, and the laughs, a commodity that is increasingly hard to come by. I sometimes think there must be a law today against smiling. So few people do. The Daltons provided me not only with smiles, but an education you could never get at the Stanford Business School. Funny moments are hard to come by, and I'd like to thank the Daltons wherever they are. And so we will stop here with that reading about the Daltons. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. Tomorrow we will be chatting about San Francisco sourdough. A staple of a San Francisco treat, right? A staple of San Francisco, sourdough and crab. I think we've got maybe 2 days left of reading. We might finish this, like I said yesterday, by the end of the week, which would be super fun. And then we'll move on to one of my grandfather's other books next week. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed the story. Why are books not full of ads like other media? Decremet is asking. I don't know, the Marked. It's a good question. I guess there's no reason to. I mean, now I think there are. Lots of books have ads for other books from the publishers, like in the backs of the books. But yeah, very interesting question. We've allowed, publishers have maintained the sanctity of the literary space free of advertising, which I can definitely appreciate. I mean, diving into a book and not having advertising, it allows you to dive in, allows you to enter the space of imagination and thought and consideration and not be pulled out of it like ads tend to do, grabbing your attention, right? Yeah. So I'm glad that books are not full of ads, but those booksellers, maybe they can keep up the crazy talk and the sales barking of carnivals and keep the smiles on our faces and hypnotize us with book sales. I don't know. I'm already half hypnotized if I walk into a bookstore, buy all the books. That you don't need to do much more to get me to buy them. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for joining me for another day of reading. I'll be back tomorrow to read more from San Francisco and my grandfather's book, Nowhere Except San Francisco. Thank you. Bye.